Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Bobby, it's telling me that I'm going to need to quit the app and then come back in just because it's never shared my screen before. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Bobby, it's telling me that I'm going to need to quit the app and then come back in just because it's never shared my screen before. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Bobby, it's telling me that I'm going to.
Well, everybody bear with us. It looks like we're having a little bit of technical problem, so we'll get started here in just a second. There we go.
There we go. All right. So yeah, I think we can go ahead and get started. For those of you who are on right at 10, I gave kind of a brief intro, but this session is just kind of designed for mostly people in high school and people starting out their college careers. And really it's about what it says. It's what you need to know about getting into medical school at those appropriate levels. If you're in high school, there are things that you can start doing in order to prepare. I know that seems early and a little crazy. And certainly in college, there's a lot that frankly needs to be done if you're preparing to become a physician. So we can go ahead and get started. A little bit of humor to start out your morning. So yeah, David, I'll let you introduce yourself and get started.
Hi, I'm David Berman. I'm a physician. I grew up in a small town in Oklahoma. Went to the University of Oklahoma and my undergraduate degree was in botany, which is a little bit of an unusual degree, but I went to medical school and did my residency at Oklahoma. And while I was in medical school, I got some additional insight into the medical school admissions process by serving on the admissions committee as third year class president in my class. Next slide. I moved to Colorado after my training. I worked in a small town for 1 year as a general internist. In the last 35 years, I've worked in a large prepaid medical practice here in Denver. Currently, that medical practice has about 1,200 physicians in it. I did a lot of administrative work during my career, and as chief of the department, I hired a lot of physicians over the years, which also gave me a lot of insight into backgrounds and physician careers. Next slide, David.
Yeah, and my name is David Kelly, and I grew up in Oklahoma initially. My dad was in the military for 34 years, so we moved around quite a bit. I also spent some time in Washington, D.C. My middle school years in the Netherlands, actually. For college, I went to New York, NYU. I graduated in 2016 with a degree in neuroscience and applied to medical school after that. As far as HOSA goes, I initially got involved in 2009 as a high school student and was Oklahoma State president and then national HOSA president from 2012 through 2013. And I've stayed involved since in helping out wherever I can, mostly at the international leadership conferences. And as it says down here, I'm just now completing my third year of medical school at the OU College of Medicine in Oklahoma City. And I've decided to match into ophthalmology next year. So the study of the eye and surgical procedures of the eye. So I guess the best first question to ask yourself if you're thinking about how to get into medical school is, should you try to get into medical school? Do you want to become a physician? And there are a lot of different ways of becoming a physician, and there are a lot of different ways of going into healthcare, and going to medical school is not the only one. And beyond that, there are a lot of different careers even within medicine. So Dr. Berman will talk over the next few slides about the different types of physicians. It runs the gamut from surgeons to clinicians, to pathologists that really are studying slides and studying tissues and disease processes all day. So generally, you just have to like learning. It's a career that involves lifelong learning. Of course, you need a good interest in science and how the body works, since that's something that you will be studying for the rest of your life in a lot of ways. And you also have to care about people. There are a lot of reasons to go into medicine, and not all of them, frankly, are very good. People say there are much easier ways to make a lot of money than going to medical school, and that's something that I think that people don't often realize, is you have to have a reason that you want to do this in order to be successful. And it can't just be your own success. It has to be about your patients and about caring for others. And this last point, I think, kind of speaks to the ways healthcare can improve life. Healthcare is always changing, and medicine is always changing. So you really have to be passionate about being a part of those changes. And again, relearning everything every few years, because medicine does change quickly, and it's exciting to be a part of that.
So there's literally dozens of kinds of doctors, and most of you've seen a physician, either a family medicine doctor or a pediatrician, when you were sick as a child, or getting your immunizations, getting your forms filled out for school sports. And so you're pretty familiar with that kind of doctor. Unfortunately, if you've had appendicitis, maybe you've met a surgeon, or if you have some other kind of health problems, you've met other kinds of doctors. But most of you are familiar with what we call primary care physicians, which is family medicine, pediatrics. And I'm a general internist. We specialize only in adults. I sort of call it, it's like we're pediatricians for adults. But there's surgeons, but there's many kinds of surgeons. And with technology, things are increasingly getting even more specialized. There's general surgeons that tend to do appendectomies and abdominal surgery, but orthopedists do knee surgery, and you have brain surgeons. And then even beyond internal medicine, people become heart doctors, cardiologists, lung specialists, pulmonary, infectious disease. Next slide. Then there's the OB/GYN, and even within each of these specialties, people become increasingly specialized. Some gynecologists may just focus on delivering babies, others work on surgical interventions. You have the emergency medicine docs who are in the news a lot these days with the COVID crisis going on. Psychiatrists, radiologists who spend most of their time in dark rooms just looking at pictures. Anesthesiologists who put people to sleep for surgery. And there's a lot of different settings for physicians to work in. Being a doctor in a big city is much different than working in a small town. Go back a slide. Some doctors may just have an educational background. Some only do research. Some get involved in public health, and public health physicians have been in the news a lot lately with the COVID crisis, epidemiologists. So there's literally dozens of kinds of careers for physicians. And, once you decide to go to medical school, that's usually a choice that's kind of finalized in the third year of medical school. People often start medical school thinking they want to be one kind of doctor, but end up changing their mind sometimes more than once before they make a final career decision.
So regarding education and when those decisions take place, it does take a while to become a practicing physician, and it doesn't end with medical school. So you start with an undergraduate degree. That's what most people consider college. It takes about 4 years usually. And kind of an emerging trend is at universities that have a relationship with a medical school, they will often have early acceptances, or what we call linkage programs, where you can complete a shortened course of study, either 2 or 3 years in most cases, and then apply into medical school thereafter. And sometimes if you maintain a GPA as in part of one of those programs, you actually could have a guaranteed acceptance to some of those. So certainly things to research. After the undergraduate degree is medical school. That's currently what I'm doing, and it lasts 4 years. Again, there are some shortened programs. I know there are some that are experimenting with a 3-year program, but the vast majority are still for 4 years. And then beyond that, there's residency training where you have the MD or DO behind your name, but you're practicing still under supervision in teaching hospitals. And that can range anywhere from 3 to 8 years. For example, for ophthalmology, I'll do 4 years of postgraduate education, they call it. So 4 years of residency, and then I'll likely do a 2-year fellowship. So you can see there that it varies based on what you want to go into. Primary care, you're usually looking at 3 or 4 years after you complete medical school. A lot of the surgical subspecialties, an average of 5 to 8. And then as Dr. Berman alluded to earlier, oftentimes those specialties within specialties will require you to do what we call a fellowship, which is after residency ends.
So if there's, some of you may be taking notes, and this is the one kind of slide I want to highlight for taking the notes for looking into your career. You may or may not remember a lot of what we say today, but the AAMC is the accreditation organization for all the medical schools across the country, and they have a very robust website with all kinds of information for people who are interested into getting into medical school and any changes that may happen with the medical school admission testing, et cetera. So if you just Google AAMC aspiring docs, not necessarily right now, but at some point, take a look at that website if you're interested in a career, and it has a whole lot of information, kind of everything you need to know, a lot of what David and I are both talking about today, but it will also go into a whole lot more detail.
So the question that I suspect a lot of you have, at least a lot of people who usually are attending the ILC in person have, is what can I do starting in my high school years to prepare for college and then, of course, for medical school? And there's no terribly easy answer other than you need to be a good student. Grades will always come number one when it comes to getting into medical school, particularly having a good foundation in math and science. So that could be biology classes, chemistry classes, physics classes, anything that's going to be tested on the entrance exam to get into medical school is great. And oftentimes this will involve AP courses or advanced placement courses. And we'll talk a little bit about this in the future. It's good to get those AP credits. You aren't necessarily going to want to use them in those college classes that are going to be tested on the MCAT, just because they may not prepare you quite as well as a true college course might, but it's something that always looks good, shows that you're really challenging yourself starting early in the process academically. You need to develop solid study habits. As I've alluded to a number of times, you'll be studying for the rest of your life in a lot of ways. And starting those habits early will allow you to achieve success throughout that time. Of course, tests will never leave you either as a physician. So developing test-taking skills early on is really important. And then also something that HOSA can help you a lot with is developing good written and verbal communication skills early on. So any of the competitive events that where you're interviewing or you are interacting with people in a professional way, either on paper or in person, which is most of the competitive events at this point, that's going to help you. Outside of academics, you can also do things we call extracurricular that can help you show an interest in medicine early on, something like volunteering in a medical setting. In fact, I believe it's still this way that the application for medical school has you list out experiences, work experiences in which you were paid, separate from work experiences in which you were a volunteer. And so they're always going to love volunteerism. It can be a big part of being a physician, working in free clinics, serving those medically underserved populations. So they'd like to see a commitment to that. You can also make inroads in the medical community and form connections by shadowing physicians. or even by working part-time in a lab or research setting. That can show early on, particularly if you are interested in conducting research in the future, a commitment to that discipline. A lot of medical schools are starting to have summer programs and internships. So certainly, at least your state schools, probably worth Googling to see if they do anything like that and have any kind of summer program or internship where you can become connected to the institution early on, even in high school. One thing that's good to note is people are always interested in the number of things they can list on their application, but really when it comes down to it, these programs are looking more for passion, and they're looking more for involvement in the things that you do put down. So maybe you had 20 things to put on your resume and on your medical school application or college application, but if you only did each of those things for 5 hours, that doesn't show as much commitment and as much discipline as doing 2 or 3 of those things for 20 or 30 hours apiece. So something to note, the things that you're interested in, make sure you're actually interested in them and you're doing them because you're enjoying them, not just to check a box. And it'll be easy to show commitment to those and talk about them in interviews. What it really comes down to is being a well-rounded student, in addition to those good academics that we talked about.
I will say, just before I get into this next slide here, just to comment on David's last slide. During this COVID era, the volunteering for activities and doing other kinds of things is maybe radically different over the next year or two. Things are, even within the medical settings, are much more restricted. So I would kind of put that in the parking lot and kind of think about that as something into the future. Hopefully within the next year or two, we'll have some vaccines that are effective. And so think about that as something kind of later, and don't be sort of thinking about that something over the next year or two. Do you have any thoughts about that, David?
Yeah, I've attended a couple of webinars for residency applications, and I think the main point is that colleges and medical students or medical schools understand the difficulties that people are facing right now, and everyone is in the same boat here. So of course, they look at the application as a whole, and just because you're missing one thing, like volunteerism, you can talk about that and talk about how the pandemic has affected your ability to do those types of things, which shows some self-awareness on your part. And it also means that programs aren't going to look at those types of things as closely. They aren't going to be as strict about people having a certain number of hours. Not that they ever are looking specifically at that, but they're probably going to be more lenient about what types of things they consider as showing interest in this environment.
Yeah. One of the biggest questions we have is, which college should I go to? And flat out, most medical students come from the larger state colleges and universities, or the public schools. If you're in Oklahoma, for instance, where David and I were, I went to the University of Oklahoma. David will talk a little bit more about where he went to school and how his GPA worked out. But most students are going to come from Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, or Florida, Florida State, or one of the state schools in Texas, or one of the state schools in California, the larger universities. If you can attend a private school, that's great. Typically that's going to involve a lot more tuition money. But if having Harvard or Stanford behind your name doesn't necessarily make you more competitive to get into medical school. In fact, you may have a lower GPA because those schools are much more competitive in their student population. So that's just, 80–90% of the students come from the large state universities. Next slide. One of the questions that comes up is, should you attend the local city or local college? For many people, they may have to work to get to school, or finances are a problem. Generally, the city and local colleges are looked at as much less competitive, which they are. And so if for whatever reasons you need to attend that kind of a school, it's generally best If you can do 1 or 2 years at a city college and then try to transfer to one of the larger state universities for your last 2 or 3 years, it's more competitive, and frankly, that's where most of the medical school applicants are accepted from. It's a more competitive and learning environment, and medical school is very competitive, and frankly, it's difficult. So you have to kind of get used to that academic rigor to succeed as a physician.
And the other question that we hear a lot of at these sessions is, what degree do I choose? And the simple answer here is that most medical students end up with a degree in one of the biological sciences. They end up in biology, chemistry, or biochemistry. So some combination of those two. But the truth is that you can go into medical school having majored in anything. As you can see in the bottom here, some of the admission requirements for medical school go along with the courses that you would need to take in order to be successful on the entrance exam, which again, we'll talk about. It's called the MCAT. But in general, medical schools actually like to see very diverse majors represented. So if you have something you're passionate about, whether it's music or some other form of art, or even something like history, you can absolutely choose to pursue that at university, as long as you're taking these prerequisite courses listed at the bottom, and making sure you have a good, solid scientific foundation for the MCAT. And for medical school, you can pretty much major in whatever you want. So as promised, I'll talk a little bit here about the medical college admission test, or the MCAT. It's really heavily weighted these days towards reading comprehension and critical thinking skills. So if you've never looked up practice questions, I don't mean to freak anyone out or make everyone nervous by telling them to look up these very hard questions 5 years in advance. But if you Google MCAT practice question sample or something of that nature, you'll see why this test is set up like this. It's not just a basic question and answer. They will actually give you passages. They'll give you scientific texts to read through, and then they ask you to answer questions about the text that you just read. And of course, often they're asking you to incorporate your own scientific knowledge, but really you can get most of the answers from the passages that they're giving you. That's why it's important to develop study skills early on, because more than a lot of things, including probably the ACT and SAT and those tests that you may be more familiar with, the MCAT is really a test-taking test more than it is a science test or a math test. You can see that it has 4 sections right now, kind of a chemistry and physics test, or section, a section that is just, they call it critical analysis and reasoning skills. So that's a reading comprehension and critical thinking test more purely. There's a biology and biochemistry section, and then a psychology and sociology section. So those are the 4, and those go along with a lot of the courses that you're going to be wanting to take to prepare you for medical school in college. The way it's scored, this is probably premature for a lot of you here, but just so you know, 125 is the median for each section. And of course, those add up to 500 when you consider the 4 sections together. And so schools will actually be able to see that breakdown in many cases, and they'll see how you scored on each section. It is important to note, getting into medical school is very competitive. So you can see that the average score of everyone who is accepted into medical school is between 510 and 512. Those numbers may have shifted in the last few years, but it's generally around that. And a score of 507 is at the 80th percentile. So that means that the average score of those that are accepted is getting into folks who scored in the 85th or even the 90th percentile on average, which is of course high.
So also, as it relates to this, is the question, I guess, what kind of college GPA do I need? Well, the higher, the better. And this gets to where David was talking about earlier. The study habits and the grades that you make in high school are the same kind of habits that you're going to carry over into college. So what you're doing right now is very important to create the pattern for how you're going to approach college. Generally, a GPA of 3.7 or up, and this is your college GPA, is considered ideal. And those are where the most competitive applicants for medical school come from. If your GPA is in the 3.4 to 3.7 range, that puts you sort of in a very large competitive middle group of students. And then if you're in that group, you're going to have to generally score very well on your MCAT score, or something else is really going to have to stand out in your application for you generally to be accepted to medical school. If your GPA is below 3.4, it's going to be really challenging and difficult on average for you to get into medical school, unless that's really offset by an extremely high MCAT score. And then you probably have to have some good reasons to explain the discrepancy in your GPA and your MCAT. And there may be some good reasons, either in the middle group or the lower group. Maybe, you had a depressive illness, or maybe there was a significant illness in your family, or some kind of a financial situation where you had to work a full-time job and that made your GPA suffer. So you just need to be able to explain, why there's the discrepancy in your GPA and your high MCAT score. But generally, you're going to need a high GPA as well as a high MCAT score, as David was just referring to. Next slide. Here's some of the, these, you can look these up on the internet. These are just some of the GPAs for students that are accepted to medical school. You can see that if you go to Harvard or Stanford, you need a higher GPA than if you go to one of the state colleges by, on average about 1/10 of a point. So that's just something to think about, whether you want to apply to a private university, one of the more prestigious colleges, as opposed to one of the state universities. The state universities are certainly fine. And again, the vast majority of people that are admitted to medical school do not come from the private prestigious universities. Next slide. In terms of how the interview process works, well, we're speaking sort of historically. We don't know what it's going to look like over the next few years, given the current COVID situation, but each school has its own system. My interview process was, I interviewed one full-time faculty, one clinical faculty, and one student, all in individual interviews. And they had their own scoring system for how to do that. And this, I learned all this when I served on the admissions committee. David could talk about his interview process. It looked a little bit different than mine. Why don't you say something about that?
Yeah, I think I may have a little bit of a slide about that in the future here. But really, my interview, and I interviewed at 3 places in the end, and it was primarily a group interview. What happened was I would walk into the room, and there were actually 3 physicians there. I believe it was 1 professor and 2 alumni of the program. And we talked for probably a good 30 to 45 minutes without them ever knowing anything about my application. So we call that a blind interview. It's up to me to talk to them about why I wanted to go into medicine and why I wanted to go to OU specifically, without them ever seeing my portfolio, my grades, my MCAT score. Then I actually left the room for a few minutes, and they opened up my application and got to look at all of that. And then I went back in and spoke with them for about another 30 minutes about the contents of that portfolio. So it really does vary, and it will vary in the future as well, with a lot of, I would imagine a lot of the interview process, at least this year, taking place via Zoom or other platforms. The formats are always going to be probably unique to each school. And so it's important to start with a strategy. So that's kind of the crux of this slide here, is that it's not enough to just go in and think that you're going to be likable to the interview committee or your interviewers. You need to have some semblance of a strategy going into these. You need to know a little bit about the format and the types of things that they're going to be looking for based on that format. So if you have several different several different stations or interview rooms that you go into, there's probably a reason that they're breaking those rooms up like that, and they're not going to ask you the same questions in every room. So knowing the context of the interview that you're about to walk into, I think is very important as you start to frame your answers to some of their questions. So a good way to prepare, probably the best way, is to have a mock interview. Of course, you can do this with friends or parents, other adults, but the best way is going to be with current professors, mentors, people who you really professionally respect, and who you know aren't going to pull any punches, as it were. And one thing to note, you don't have to know all the answers to the questions. I think a lot of people waste time developing these very scripted answers to 50 or 100 common interview questions. They may never be asked any of those. So I always think it's important to be honest with your answers. And an honest answer might be, I don't know the answer to that, but I'll be happy to get back with you via email or otherwise later in the interview even. I actually did that during a few questions during my OU interview. They tend to ask a lot of questions telling me to call back to a time when something happened. So tell us about a time when you had a conflict and how you resolved it. Maybe put on the spot in the next 5 seconds, I can't think of a conflict, but I can tell them that. I can say, I know I've overcome conflict with others before. I can't think of a specific instance right now, but let me think about that and come back to you after another couple questions, and I'll mull that over. And that's a perfectly acceptable answer. Probably the best way to figure out the context of a particular interview, and again, that might look different this year, but if you know medical students who are currently going to that program, you can talk to them about the questions they were asked, because universities don't just come up with new questions every year and completely new formats every year. So the more information you can get about those interviews before you go, probably the more prepared and the more relaxed you'll be, and the better you'll perform.
I want to just add in there, the interviews are really a critical piece. On paper, a lot of applicants look kind of the same. The GPA and the MCAT score may look the same, and the impression that you make during the interview is really critical. And David's point about literally having practice interviews ahead of time, it will make you much more comfortable when you go into the interview. Just like anything else you do in life, the more practice you can get at it before you actually have to compete, the better at it that you're going to be.
Yeah, so one thing that you can do, it's kind of an interesting strategy in the middle of an interview, is develop rapport with your interviewing team. So of course you're going to answer their questions honestly, and you're going to answer their questions in a way that's going to show you in the best light. But it's also important to share a more personal side of yourself. So show your personality a little bit, because that's what people are going to connect with. So as Dr. Berman was talking about, the interview is incredibly important. They've seen that you have what it takes on paper to succeed in medical school. What they're really looking at when it comes time for an interview is this person a good fit for our program? And quite frankly, a lot of that just comes down to personality. Do they think that you're going to gel with their faculty and with their current students and other students they're considering admitting? So I talk about that a little bit on this slide, but it certainly helps if you have a champion on your interviewing team that says, I really connected with this person. I think they would be a very, very good fit at our institution. One kind of logistic thing that always comes up is, how many medical schools do I apply to? So when it comes to undergraduate degrees and colleges, often people are just applying to 2 or 3 or 4 because they're reasonably confident that they can obtain admission to those programs. In medical school, really being confident that you're going to gain admission to any program would be a mistake, because they are highly competitive. I would never counsel anyone or suggest that anyone just apply to 1 or 2 schools. So generally, everyone does want to apply to their in-state medical schools. The way that these colleges are funded is separate from how a private medical school might function. And as such, in the state that you have residency, you're much more likely to gain admission than you are at any school, probably out of state, just because of the way that their admissions work. So certainly any medical schools in your state, you can obviously say you have a connection to them geographically. Other than that, a lot of people do apply to private medical schools. They're generally more expensive. They're generally about the same cost as attending a public school at a different state. And so that ends up being about double the cost of your in-state state school. They're also more competitive. So this is where a lot of the Ivy Leagues come in. Most of them have medical schools, schools like that. One thing to note, it can be expensive to apply to all these places. And I'll talk a little bit about my experience again coming up. But you're also, in a lot of cases, signing up, if you obtain an interview, to traveling to those places. And again, that'll be different this year because folks will be far less comfortable doing a lot of travel. So probably a lot more virtual interviews. But one thing to note is if you're applying to a lot of places and getting a lot of interviews, you're going to be more competent at those later interviews. So if you're really excited about a particular program, scheduling their interview for later in the season may actually be to your benefit because maybe you've heard some of those questions before and have prepared answers. As far as where you want to go, I think it's important to think about what your long-term goals are. So are you just wanting to be a physician in the community, clinical practice? If so, you may be more interested in going to your public in-state school. Whereas if you're interested in really high-level research, things like combined MD PhD programs, or some of these really prestigious teaching hospitals, you may consider applying to some private schools that have a lot of funding for research. So it's always just weighing, where you want to be along physically, like geographically, where you want to be in the country, and then also where you see yourself academically and in practice. So at this point, I'd like to talk a little bit about my application, my experience. So Dr. Berman talked earlier about going to some of these competitive private schools. You may end up with a lower GPA. I actually did. So you can see here, my GPA was a 3.52, which is generally, as he said, puts me in a large, really competitive pool of applicants from which I would need to separate myself in order to, have a great chance of getting into any particular school. And so I did that with the MCAT. I took a course and I studied really hard and I did very well on it. So this, I think it's important to share because not every aspect of your application has to be perfect. You do not have to have a 4.0 to get into medical school. But on balance, you just need to ensure that your application is reasonably well-rounded and also competitive as a whole. And mentors, either faculty at medical schools who you may know or you may be able to connect with through some of those summer programs, or people at your university may be able to talk to you about your application and talk to you about your likelihood of obtaining admission based on what they're seeing from your academics and your application as a whole. So I applied to about 15 schools, both MD and DO programs. We'll talk about the differences here in just a minute. I ended up receiving 3 interviews and I was accepted at those 3 institutions. For those 15 schools, it was about $2,000 in application fees, and that doesn't include the cost of traveling to New York for one of those interviews. And here again, where I talk about my interviews being either 3-on-1 or 2-on-1 with faculty and alumni at the program. Another thing that I talked about earlier was if you're having to go into separate rooms, multiple rooms to do parts of the interview, a lot of schools have termed that the multiple mini interview. And again, they're going to share that likely in advance with you, and they're going to tell you what to expect with the differences that you'll experience in each of those rooms as far as the subject matter of the questions they're asking you. Another thing that medical schools do, which is really great, that a lot of colleges do as well, is they'll have a second look day where if you're accepted to multiple schools, you can go back and give them a chance to kind of impress you and wow you with their facilities and their medical school experience. And that can be very helpful if you're not sure where you want to go, if you're accepted at multiple institutions.
One of the other questions that comes up is, should you apply to an osteopathic medical school? And some of you may not even know the differences between an osteopathic and what we call an allopathic medical school. Historically, the osteopathic career path for physicians was looked at, I think, by the allopathic community with some disdain. And I think historically, the educational experience of the osteopathic students in the past was not nearly as good as it was in what we would term the allopathic medical schools. And that's really changed a lot in the last few decades. And currently there's a movement to create one national accreditation body. Currently there's two different accreditation bodies for the osteopathic and the allopathic medical schools. But pretty much now, I think the educational experience is generally good in all the osteopathic colleges. Some people still feel like it may be a sort of a inferior kind of degree. It's a DO degree as opposed to an MD degree, but increasingly, I think they're looked at as the same. And it doesn't necessarily hurt you when you finish school in terms of applying to some of the different residency programs and fellowship programs. In my medical group of 1,200 doctors, we have certainly not the majority, but not an insignificantly small percent of physicians who are osteopathic physicians. If you look at the osteopathic matriculant scores, you can see that the average applicant to an osteopathic medical school, their GPA is 3.58, where it's 3.7 for the allopathic medical schools. And their MCAT scores are also significantly lower. So generally the competitive quality of the medical student and applicant into the allopathic path is still lower than what it is for the MD path. Next slide. So another question we often get is, if you don't get admitted to medical school on the first time, what should you do? Well, if you think that you're at least in the highly competitive group with an adequate GPA and adequate MCAT score, certainly in that sort of the 90th percentile plus, maybe you tripped up in the interview the first time, or who knows what happened. You may look equally competitive to other students, but try again. And certainly that's happened to some friends of mine. They didn't make it the first time. And certainly if you're in the middle group of students, again, where people kind of look the same, and maybe you did sort of average on your GPA and your MCAT score, and maybe you didn't really shine out during your interview, but maybe you can figure out how to buff up your interview a little bit, or spend the next year after your year that you didn't get in, do something to make yourself a better person or a better future physician. Demonstrate to the admissions committee that you're really committed to a career in medicine, and that's something that you want to do, and you just didn't try to get in and, oh, I didn't make it the first time, and so I'm going to give it up and do something else. Should you go, if you don't make it, sometimes what happens is people only apply to the MD allopathic schools, and then they'll apply to the osteopathic schools. And I'm not sure how that really looks to the osteopathic interview committee. They're really looking for people to excel, but a lot of times that's what people will do. They'll apply to an osteopathic medical school. I think David's strategy of applying to the osteopathic school in the first round is probably a better strategy, because you're sort of showing the osteopathic school that you consider them to be equal to the allopathic schools. If you don't get in the first time, should you go to a medical school in Mexico or in the Caribbean? There's other schools that are set up that sometimes people do the first and second year of medical school, and then transfer back in to the United States. I know some people that have done that. They've had, successful careers as physicians. Again, in the COVID era, who knows what that looks like? I don't, everything's changed and nobody knows. But I think generally, if you try to get in 2 or 3 times into medical school and you didn't make it, you might want to consider a different career. As David said earlier, there's many, many paths to help take care of people besides being a physician. And there's all kinds of career paths as HOSA, I'm sure, has exposed you to. Next slide.
Yeah, so I talked a little bit earlier about fees for applying to medical school, and some of that can be sticker shock, but you can also get sticker shock with the cost of medical school itself. So it's important to keep in mind that as a physician, you generally are very successful. And you can see here that a career in medicine will put you at a high income category, even considering that many physicians don't start their practices and don't start making their full salary until late in their 20s or early on in their 30s. But it's important that to note that along with that higher salary comes with a higher cost of the education. So a lot of people graduating from medical school have loans from their undergraduate degree and also from medical school itself. So don't hold me to these averages, but I believe on average, an in-state medical school, the tuition tends to be somewhere between $30,000 and $40,000 a year. And then you can expect about double that. So $60,000 to $80,000 a year for the private universities or an out-of-state public university. And of course, that's per year. And so loans of at least $300,000 too are not terribly uncommon. So if you can find ways to offset the cost of your undergraduate degree, and so as we were talking about earlier, maybe going to one of those state schools where you could even get a scholarship and get a lot of that tuition covered, may be a better financial option for you than going to a more prestigious university, even if you're able to get into both. So here I'd like to talk a little bit about medical school once you get in. I know that's not really the focus of this lecture or this talk, but it is important to know kind of what you're signing up for. So in general, the first 2 years of most medical schools are preclinical. So those are going to look a lot like college courses where you're sitting in a classroom or even at home when they're allowing you to view lectures remotely, which is kind of a really great perk that some medical schools have, where you're able to learn at your own pace. They trust you at that point to ensure that you're ready for each test, even not being there in person for all of the lectures. It is difficult. Those first 2 years, especially, it's a really intense curriculum. You're learning kind of the foundations of all of medicine in those 2 years. Oftentimes they'll group it based on body system. So you're learning all about the heart in a matter of 5 or 6 weeks, for example. So it is difficult. But what's nice is that there's a good sense of camaraderie that you may not have even among your pre-med peers in college, because you're not really in competition with your medical school classmates like you might be with your pre-med classmates. So it's a really good environment, I think, for learning. The opportunity to tutor each other and have study groups and help each other out is really great. There is still some competition for residency programs, especially if you want to go into something that's very, very competitive, like a lot of the surgical subspecialties. But I would say even then, it's nowhere near the degree that there is the competition of getting into medical school itself. So we always like to say here, what do they call the person that graduates last in their medical school class? Well, they call them doctor. So I think there can be a little bit of a shock when people are used to being used to excelling and being at the top of their class in high school and then also at university. Then they come to medical school and you have to realize everyone has been at the top of their class. So just because you've been able to be there in the past doesn't mean that necessarily that's going to continue in medical school. But it's important to know that's just how the system works, and it's nothing wrong with you. It's just the fact that medical schools are only letting in very, very competitive applicants. And so it's nothing to feel bad about. Here's some of the resources we talked about. I've blogged a little bit at the HOSA blog. Of course, the HOSA website is hosa.org. And if you go under news, you can see the blog. Our current executive council has made some posts on it more recently, but earlier on, several years back, I did a series about kind of my journey through high school and college and getting into medical school, and then a little bit about medical school itself. So if you're interested, you can read those. Also, Dr. Berman alluded to the AAMC Aspiring Docs. That really is kind of the go-to resource, especially starting in high school for figuring out if you want to go into medicine. And also they have a lot of great official resources for how to make that happen. Another thing that when people get into college, they start to look into is something called the medical school admission requirements. That's something, it used to cost about $20 for a year subscription. I don't know if it's gone up in price or down, but that just kind of gives you an overview of how competitive each medical school is. And it gives you their average numbers as far as GPA and MCAT of the students who apply, and then the students that are ultimately accepted. So generally, you only just buy that in the year that you're going to apply to medical school to make a list of schools at which you want to apply based on where you think you might be competitive. So we'll end with more humor. Sometimes it does feel like this. I'm on internal medicine right now, and with such a wide variety of things that could be ailing patients, it can sometimes seem to them like we're coming at them, with needles from all sides as far as blood draws and all these tests that we order. But now I think we have just a few minutes. I don't know if we're going to be cut off right at 11, but we're absolutely open to hearing your questions and answering a few of them. I don't know if we can make it so that people can unmute themselves to ask, but does anyone have a question? Try to unmute yourself and ask, or in the chat as well.
So I live in Cincinnati, and I know that UC, University of Cincinnati, and Cincinnati in general, is big for medicine, and it's a very high-rated medical school. Do you think that that would be a good choice, even though it's not a state college, but just because it's so advanced in medicine?
So it can be. Are you saying, is this an undergraduate school?
Yes, and then I think they also have a medical school there.
Okay. Yeah, anywhere that is going to have a rigorous academic curriculum is going to be fine. If they have a relationship with a medical school, aka if they have a medical school, then absolutely, I think that's a great choice. But also, if it is very competitive, you're going to want to look at multiple programs to ensure you're not putting all of your eggs in one basket. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Sorry. So in your opinion, what's the best time to take the MCAT?
So I guess I can take this one too. I actually took it at the end of my senior year because I wanted to make sure I had taken some of the upper level biochemistry courses, and I was fine taking a year off before medical school after my undergraduate degree. So most people end up taking it during the spring of their junior year in college, because that's the time frame that will allow you to go directly into medical school, to interview during your senior year, and to go directly into medical school after the fall of graduation. But a lot of people also end up taking a gap year, and that's just fine too. As long as you're doing something with it and you're continuing to show growth professionally and personally, they're going to be fine with you taking that if you want to wait until your senior year to take the MCAT. I don't know of anyone taking it before their junior year, unless they're in one of those special programs where you only have to do 2 or 3 years of college in order to gain entrance to medical school.
I'm looking at a few of the chat questions. One of the chat questions is, can you get into the medical school majoring in public health? And the answer to that is absolutely. Again, as David alluded to, you just have to take all the prerequisites in biology, physics, chemistry. Chemistry is always, organic chem is like the differentiator in terms of chemistry for a lot of people. You can do undergraduate in anything. Another question was, how long does the application process take? David, I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, it's generally about a year, and that's an academic year. So as I said, most people start by taking the MCAT. They start studying for it maybe over winter break of their junior year, their third year of college. And then those applications are generally due later, maybe in the summer or fall of your senior year. And then I would say in most cases, you've gained admission, you've gotten admission decisions by early on in that spring of your senior year. So all in all, about a year total. A lot of that is just because there are logistics of traveling to places for interviews, and also the time that you take studying the MCAT. I also saw something here about a combined BSMD program. With all of these combined programs, they can only enhance your application. What I think is important to note, again, is just you have to figure out what you want to do in medicine. So if you know that you want to be, for example, involved in leadership, and you want to, as a physician, help run a hospital or a medical system and get really involved in administration, it may be good to do something like an MBA, for example. You could even do that in a gap year in between college and medical school. So I think it's just important to make sure that you're doing it not just because it's competitive or because you feel like it might make you look more competitive. It may, but I think it's important to also just do it because you want to do it and you know it's going to lead to success in whatever kind of niche of medicine that you're able to carve out with it.
Let's see, another question was about study habits. What study habits helped you a lot? Just studying. So, like, you just have to listen to what the teacher says, prepare for the test, follow your homework assignments both in high school and college. I don't know if there's, David, you may want to speak to that. I don't know if there's any special kind of courses or things you can take. I didn't do anything particularly special. I just tried to work really hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say for the ACT and SAT and the MCAT as well, there are preparatory courses that, and oftentimes they are expensive, that may help you take those kinds of tests. So multiple choice tests in particular, like I said with the MCAT, they're really test-taking tests more than they are anything else. So if that's something you struggle with, one of those courses may help you, and it will certainly apply to tests that you take in college and in medical school as well. Those test-taking skills tend to be pretty universal. We also had a question above about advice for writing personal statements or college admissions essays. Dr. Berman, what do you think about that?
When I wrote my essay, I talked to some mentors I had from college who then had gone on to law school and done other careers, but they were, my residential advisor. And so there are people who are professionally oriented in their career, and I got advice from people about what to say and what not to say, and even about kind of what language to use. And that I found that very helpful, not just sort of preparing on my own and not just asking people my own age.
Yeah, I know.
Or other people, but asking people who were mentors to me, and that was very helpful. What did you do, David?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely important to show your essay to a lot of people. And something that we've kind of alluded to is most colleges will have a a pre-med advisor or some sort of graduate advisor that is going to be able to walk through your application with you and really help you figure out how competitive you are and how you can make yourself more competitive. So if you're a high school senior who's starting college in the fall, definitely connect with those people even in your very first year of college, because they're going to be able to help you craft what your next 4 years looks like, because ultimately that's what medical schools are going to be interested in. And of course, the personal statement and an application essay for any school is stressful for a lot of people because it's hard to know what to say. And a lot of times those professionals are really good at drawing the types of things out that are going to look good and are going to really get at the heart of why you're applying to a particular program. And I know we are past time, so if anyone needs to go, feel free. Don't feel obligated to stay. I'm fine staying and answering a few more questions. We had an interesting question about the COVID-19 pandemic, and as you alluded to, people may not be able to volunteer this year. People may not be able to even interact much with patients this year in volunteer settings or in work settings even. I think it's certainly harder this year to show interest in medicine. I don't think it's impossible though. Certainly reach out to those contacts you have and figure out if there's any way that they feel that you could show interest. And also even just within your community, as communities kind of start to open up, and again, all that is somewhat tenuous, but thinking more locally as far as volunteer experiences, anything that could serve as a substitute volunteerism doesn't have to be medical volunteerism. So the pandemic has provided a lot of opportunity, I think, for really hyper-local volunteerism as communities come together to help each other out. I realize that's not a simple answer. The more simple answer I can give you is that you don't need to worry about it as much as you would under normal circumstances. So including how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected your ability to show interest in your personal statement or your essay, for example, I think is going to be very important this year. It's something I'm planning on incorporating into my application for residency programs too, because I'm not able to visit those programs this year. So I think, as with everything, it is going to make it harder this year to get those experiences. It just makes other aspects of the application more important, so grades and MCAT scores. And B, it provides opportunity for you to kind of explain how the pandemic has affected that.
Trying to combine a couple of questions here. When did we choose to become doctors, and why did we choose to become doctors instead of other health careers? I remember looking at a slide of blood cells in 6th grade, which really had a big impact on me. And, I remember experience like when a doctor sewed me up after I fell down and cut myself as a child. And so I had exposure to physicians growing up, and my dad actually had a career in pharmacy, but so I had a lot of exposure to physicians. I actually worked in this pharmacy, and I did not have as much exposure to nursing or physician assistant programs. Being a physician assistant or nurse practitioner is actually, I think, a pretty interesting career and gives you, in some ways, a lot more flexibility than being a doctor. If you become an internist like I did, or an ophthalmologist, as David wants to do, it kind of locks you in for the rest of your life to do that. That's all you're going to do. And if you decide 10 years into the career you want to do something else, you can, but you're more or less kind of stuck doing that. A PA and nurse practitioners have a lot more flexibility in their careers, and I have a lot of friends that work in that profession. They have great careers, and one of my good friends worked in internal medicine for 5 years, and then she switched to neurosurgery, where she worked for the next 20 years, and now she's doing palliative care, which is taking care of people who are dying. So that would have been a nice option which I didn't have, and I suspect David won't have. David, when did you decide you wanted to become a doctor, and why?
Yeah, so I did kind of a specialized high school program here in Oklahoma that exposed me to science as it relates to medicine early on. And that's actually when I got involved in HOSA in 2009. So HOSA played a big part in that, but also so did that coursework. I knew that I really enjoyed science, but I don't have any family in the healthcare field. So I was exposed to it more organically and realized pretty early on in high school that, hey, this is a good way to continue to study science, which I love and I'm good at, but in a way that allows me to interact with people on a day-to-day basis and really help them. And then just a last couple that I wanted to answer. Someone asked about shadowing a physician in high school. And that's something that I didn't mention earlier. You know, I think it's very appropriate, especially in these times, to reach out to any connections that you have, family connections, connections in your community, you know, through school, through friends. Reach out and ask them their thoughts about how you could further your application right now. I don't know how many physicians are going to be able to have shadowing students right now. It really depends, quite frankly, on what area of the country you're probably in. But just know that that's not necessarily a requirement. Again, especially this year, they're not going to expect that you were able to shadow anyone. But certainly reaching out to connections. Some big hospital systems also, you can just search for shadowing and volunteer experiences. And oftentimes they will be willing to connect you to a practitioner, again, in normal times, who would be glad to take you around with them for a day or two. So don't be afraid to kind of cold email those people and just, you know, ask if there are opportunities, because a lot of these large hospital systems have specific either educational departments or volunteer departments that handle those types of requests.
There were several questions. Well, I'll try to combine together, and I don't know if the people who asked the questions were here earlier in the presentation or if you joined late, but they relate to sort of your college degree and what college courses and things you should take. Literally any college degree is fine, and any course you want to take in college is fine. You know, I had a friend who had a major in English, and but one of the questions was, does taking a foreign language make a difference? Those kind of things don't really matter. My degree actually required a foreign language. But anything that you want to do in your undergraduate degree is fine, but you just have to take the core required courses, and you have to do well in those core required courses. And there's a separate GPA scoring just for the math and science scores. So those things are all fine.
All
I
right.
also have a question.
Mhm.
What extracurriculars or other activities like outside of school did you participate in that you would say boosted your application?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And really, it could be anything. Again, you want to make sure it's things that you're passionate about. So in my case, in high school, that was primarily HOSA. I got very, very involved pretty quickly. And so when I was applying to college, again, there were only a few things listed under extracurriculars as far as high school for me going into college. And the vast majority of them were HOSA related things. But what I was able to do is really dive deep into that in college interviews and the essay, and explain why, you know, I don't have 10 or 15 things to list here, but the 2 or 3 things that I have listed, I've spent a great deal of time and effort on. In college, I did a number of things. Again, I was HOSA president my freshman year of college, but then after that, you know, I volunteered and I continued to shadow. I actually volunteered at a hospital emergency department, which is something that probably isn't advisable this year, but in a lot of cases can get you directly in front of patients, and medical schools like to see that. And then I also worked part of the way through my college career, as it were, my degree, in order to pay and offset some of the cost of college. And so pretty much anything where you can explain why you did this and really show commitment to whatever you're doing is going to be absolutely fine. So there are not boxes that you have to check necessarily.
And I don't even know how critical it is. I'm kind of reflecting back. It's been a long time ago. I'm not as young as David is, but I didn't have a whole lot of extracurricular activities. But I just scored really well. My GPA and MCAT scores were really high, and I was really just passionate about being a doctor. I remember some of the interview questions were, like, what kind of books are you reading right now? And they were things that were, pretty disparate from medicine. And I think that really kind of piqued the interest of the person that was interviewing me. So extracurricular activities, while suggested, I don't think are necessarily critical. The biggest thing still to underscore everything we've been saying for the last hour is you got to be a good student. You have to have a good GPA. You have to have good MCAT scores. You have to have a good interview, and you have to show that you're passionate about the career that you want to pursue. Other things are just kind of a little bit of extra icing on the cake, but may not even be that critical. I don't know if you feel different than that, David, or what the experience of other students currently are. Things were competitive 40 years ago, but they're even more competitive now. So I don't know if it makes a bigger difference now than it did a long time ago. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I would echo that. I do think that it's more imperative these days to show that you're a well-rounded student on your application and not just seem like one in your interview. They're really kind of looking for a good balance of all aspects. But again, I've said it a number of times today, there are not specific boxes there. It's really anything that you're doing that's making you a well-rounded student, even if it has nothing to do with medicine. If you are on the sports team, any sports team in your college, anything athletic or anything musical, maybe you took a few years off after college and joined the symphony. They love things like that because it brings diversity to their class, and it therefore brings diversity to the physicians that they're graduating. We're getting a note here that we need to wrap up. So I can ask one more question that we actually just got in. What things do you do to stay motivated throughout the long schooling process? And for me, that's just, you really have to take it back to patients and back to the people that you're going to be serving. It does seem like a horribly long time to be in school, but the reality is, now that I'm past the second year of medical school, it feels a lot less like school, and it feels a lot more like training to become a physician. So I'm able to interact with patients and talk to them and learn about them, and also to help treat them. So even though we talk about residency and fellowship, a lot of that feels like being a physician. It's just technically still training.
So thanks to everyone today for joining us, and good luck in your careers, and work hard, and we really wish you the best in the future. Absolutely.
And just so you know, this was also live stream on YouTube at youtube.com/National HOSA. So you can rewatch this presentation in the future if you'd like. Let your friends know. And yeah, we hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks so much for tuning in, everyone.